"Keep your dog off my property, or I swear I'll call animal control." The voice came from the porch of an old farmhouse, brittle and biting like the wind that swept across the empty Kansas fields. Thomas, a retired mechanic in his late 60s, stood stiffly in the doorway, hands trembling not from fear, but from frustration. His voice hadn't been raised in months, not since the accident that silenced the rest of his home down in the yard. Near the edge of the dry, cracked road stood a German shepherd. Her coat was dusty, her ribs faintly visible under patches of shedding fur, but her posture held quiet strength. Behind her, 3 small pups huddled close, their movements slow, uncertain, but the mother wasn't begging. She wasn't barking. She just stood there, eyes locked on the man, like she knew something he didn't. Thomas cursed under his breath and stepped back inside, slamming the door harder than necessary. He didn't have time for strays. Not anymore. The house was too quiet now, filled with old photographs he couldn't look at and a baby crib that hadn't been touched in 9 months. He had boarded up that room himself, but the next morning she was there again. Same spot, same stare. This time 1 puppy was missing from the bundle behind her. Thomas watched from the window, coffee untouched in his hand, heart stubborn as ever. He waited for her to leave. Instead, she walked forward slow. Deliberate and placed something gently on the edge of his front steps. A puppy, small, shivering, eyes barely open. Then she backed away. Thomas froze. He opened the door, cautiously at first, expecting the mother to react, but she didn't growl, didn't move, just watched. The puppy made a faint whimper, curling into itself. Thomas stood there, caught between instinct and pain. Then, as if pulled by something deeper than reason, he knelt and scooped up the pup. The second his hands closed around the tiny body, something inside him broke. The dam he'd built with anger and silence gave way. Tears welled in his eyes, sudden, uninvited. He hadn't cried since the funeral, not when he buried his daughter, not even when he packed up her baby clothes. But now, holding that trembling, helpless life in his hands, he couldn't hold it in. Behind him, the wind carried the quiet creak of the screen door and the German shepherd. She sat down calmly at the base of the steps, as if she knew this was where the healing had to begin. The puppy nestled into Thomas's flannel shirt as though it had known his heartbeat forever. Tiny and warm, it fit in his hands like a memory he hadn't realized he'd been longing to touch. The German shepherd didn't move. She simply sat, her eyes never leaving him, breathing calmly through her nose, as if watching over something precious now outside of her own care. Thomas stood up slowly, his legs shaky beneath him, not from age, but from the sudden emotional weight crashing against years of walls he'd built brick by brick. Inside the house, the air felt different. As he crossed the threshold, he hadn't opened the curtains in months, but sunlight still managed to find the cracks in his grief. He laid the puppy gently on a folded towel on the couch and returned to the porch. The mother was still there, unmoving, and behind her, the other 2 puppies huddled in the dirt, their heads lifting just slightly when they saw him. He didn't understand it. Why here? Why him? Why would a dog hand over her baby to a man who hadn't touched Joy in nearly a year? He didn't know yet that she had seen something the rest of the world had forgotten. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat beside the little creature he'd begun calling it Chip, because of the small brown mark on its ear, and watched the steady rise and fall of its belly. Every so often it would whimper, and Thomas would instinctively reach over, letting his fingers brush its tiny side until it calmed. The next morning, the shepherd returned. She didn't bring anything, didn't ask for anything. She just sat outside his porch again, her 2 remaining puppies lying behind her like bookends. Thomas, still in his old work jacket and worn slippers, opened the door without thinking. He walked down the steps, stood a few feet from her, and did something he hadn't done since the accident. He crouched and extended his hand. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and touched her nose to his palm. That simple moment cracked something wide open. Over the next few days, a rhythm began. Every morning the mother would appear with her 2 pups and sit nearby while Thomas fed Chip and made sure he was warm. At first, she'd stay just a few minutes, but eventually she began staying longer, even resting under the porch while her pups explored the patch of grass that had once been a garden. Thomas would leave scraps, nothing fancy, just old stew or bread softened in milk, and she'd accept them gently, almost gratefully. But on the 5th day, something changed. That morning she arrived without her other 2 puppies. She looked tired, slower, like she'd been somewhere far. Her coat was dusty and matted near the legs. She sat on the porch again but didn't lie down. She just watched the door. Thomas noticed immediately something was wrong. He opened the door, Chip tucked gently in his arms, and stepped onto the porch. "Where?" he asked, barely realizing he was speaking aloud. She didn't move. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that carried something too heavy to name. Thomas made a decision then, not with words, but with motion. He stepped down from the porch, grabbed a flashlight from inside, and followed the trail she had taken so many mornings in reverse. She walked ahead, pausing every few steps to make sure he was still there. It wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes out into the edge of the woods behind the wheat fields. There, beneath the hollow of a fallen tree, Thomas saw them, the 2 puppies, Still, one already gone, the other barely breathing. He knelt down and felt the world tilt sideways. The shepherd let out a soft, broken whine. Without hesitation, Thomas took off his jacket, gently lifted the weak pup into its folds, and turned back, heart racing. He didn't know if it would make it, but he couldn't let it die alone. Not like this. Back at the house, he wrapped the second pup in towels warmed by the fireplace. He whispered to it, the way he once whispered to his daughter when she woke from nightmares. The way he hadn't allowed himself to whisper since the crash took her. And the baby she never got to hold. He called the local vets, something he hadn't done in years, and begged them to come. "There's no time," he said. "Please." When the vet arrived and took the puppy's temperature, she looked at Thomas with cautious hope. "You did good," she said. "It's weak, but it's got a chance." The German shepherd never left the porch that night. She curled beside the door and listened to the quiet sounds of a pup fighting to survive. And inside, Thomas sat awake again, this time between two tiny lives, one sleeping peacefully, one gasping through recovery. The next morning, when the sun spilled through the east-facing window, both puppies were still breathing, and for the first time in 9 months, so was he. The following week unfolded like something out of a second life Thomas never expected to live. The quiet, hollow rhythm that once filled his farmhouse had been replaced by tiny, soft breaths at all hours, faint whimpers, and the sound of 4 padded feet occasionally pacing across his porch. Mornings now began with fresh towels warming by the stove, a bowl of lukewarm goat's milk stirred with crushed vitamins, and 2 pups tucked beside one another like siblings, one barely saved, the other slowly blooming. He had named the second pup Milo, after the old song his daughter used to sing while cleaning her paintbrushes in the kitchen sink. Leaf by leaf, moment by moment, Thomas found himself unraveling. But this unraveling didn't hurt. It was as though years of grief were being gently pulled apart by fragile paws, and what lay underneath was something he hadn't dared hope for again. Purpose. The German shepherd had not left. She slept on the porch every night, eyes half open, ears twitching at the faintest sound. She accepted food and water but never entered the house, despite the open door. There was something noble about her restraint, as if she knew this was a space Thomas needed to reclaim on his own. On the 9th morning, something remarkable happened. While Thomas stood by the kitchen sink preparing formula, he turned and saw her. She had stepped inside, cautiously, silently, but fully, her paws touching the old wooden floor as if it were sacred ground. She didn't sniff or wonder. Instead, she walked over to the pups, lay beside them, and exhaled a long breath that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. Thomas didn't move. He simply watched her, standing in the amber light of dawn, and felt something settle deep in his chest. It wasn't just the pups who had found shelter here. She had too. That afternoon, he drove into town for the first time in months. People who hadn't seen him since the funeral stared, unsure whether to approach. Some waved awkwardly, and one older woman touched his shoulder at the feed store. "Good to see you, Thomas. We were worried." He nodded but didn't explain. How could he put into words that the thing which had pulled him back from the edge wasn't a doctor or a neighbor, but a stray dog and 2 barely breathing pups? On the way home, he stopped by the vet's office to pick up more medicine for Milo. As he turned to leave, the vet called out, "Thomas, have you thought about keeping them?" He paused. His hand lingered on the door. "I haven't stopped thinking about it." That night, as the wind picked up and a soft drizzle began to fall against the windows, Thomas gathered the 3 of them, Milo, Chip, and their mother, whom he had silently begun calling Luna. He brought in a second dog bed, lined it with old clothes, and dimmed the lights in the living room. But just as he sat down in his recliner, he noticed something unusual. Luna was staring at the back door. She stood up, paced once, then turned and looked at him, not with panic, but urgency. Thomas rose, grabbed his coat, and followed her outside. She led him across the yard, past the driveway, toward the same edge of the woods where he had found the second puppy. But tonight was different. The sky was darker. The wind carried a strange scent, damp, almost metallic. Then he heard a low growl. Not from Luna, from deeper in the woods. Her posture shifted, protective, alert. Thomas stopped walking. He could just make out a flash of movement behind the trees, eyes low to the ground. A coyote, maybe 2, thin, fast-moving shadows with too much hunger in their steps. Luna stepped forward, a growl now rising from her chest, deep and sharp. Thomas backed away instinctively, but Luna held her ground, and then, just as quickly as the threat appeared, it vanished. The coyotes, sensing they were outmatched, or perhaps sensing the unshakable will of a mother defending her own, disappeared into the trees. Thomas fell to one knee, hand gripping his side, heart pounding in his ears. Luna turned, walked back to him, and pressed her head softly into his arm. In that moment, under the heavy sky, Thomas realized something terrifying and beautiful. She hadn't come to him because she needed help. She came because she trusted him to protect what mattered most, and he had. When they returned to the house, the puppies stirred slightly, sensing their mother's presence again. Thomas crouched beside the small bed and looked at them, 2 fragile lives that should have never survived, now sleeping in safety, in peace. He placed his hand gently on Luna's back and whispered, "You didn't just give me your puppy. They gave me a reason to get back up." She looked at him, eyes shining in the dim glow, and leaned into his hand, and for the first time since the world had fallen apart, Thomas felt it rebuilding quietly, gently, one heartbeat at a time. Thomas didn't notice how quickly the days began to slip by. What started as a reluctant rescue had evolved into something deeply entwined with his very breath. The farmhouse, once heavy with silence and memories he refused to touch, now pulsed with gentle life. Chip had grown stronger, his legs sturdier, his barks louder, and his eyes more curious with each sunrise. Milo, once the fragile one teetering on the edge of survival, now chased after his brother with clumsy joy. And Luna, always watchful, always calm, had become the silent guardian of the home. She rarely left their side, except for the occasional patrol through the edge of the woods, always returning before dusk like clockwork. But Thomas still hadn't gone into that room. The nursery, it remained sealed behind a closed door and dust-covered memories, untouched since the day he lowered the tiny white casket into the earth beside his daughters. His wife had never come back from that day. Not really. Her body remained for a few weeks, hollow and drifting, before she quietly left. A note, no anger, just sorrow too deep to carry beside someone else's. He hadn't let anyone in since, but that morning something shifted. It began with a sound of faint yelp. Thomas jumped from the kitchen table where he'd been sipping his coffee and rushed to the living room. Milo was nowhere to be seen. Chip barked once, high-pitched and alarmed, then took off toward the hallway. Thomas followed, heart thudding. And there at the end of the hallway, the door to the nursery wide open, sat Milo. His tail wagged slowly, head tilted at the crib. Beside him stood Luna, motionless. The room was just as he'd left it. Soft, pink curtains swayed slightly from the draft. A mobile of stars hung over the crib, still spinning as if touched by invisible fingers. The air felt different in here, heavier but not hostile, almost like the past had been waiting patiently for him to return on his own terms. Thomas stood in the doorway, frozen. Luna turned, looked at him, then back at the crib. Then for a moment it felt like he could breathe again. He stepped in. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet. He walked past the bookshelf lined with picture books and sat slowly on the rocker. Chip padded in behind him, curling at his feet. Milo lay down near the corner, sighing. Thomas looked at the crib for a long time, then closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone he'd lost. To the daughter he couldn't save, to the grandchild who never got to live, to the version of himself that had shut out the world. And as if the universe had been waiting for that crack in his heart to open just wide enough, a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't the mailman. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a teenage boy, maybe 16, 17, awkward posture, shaggy hair, holding something wrapped in a towel. His eyes were wide with fear, and before he could even speak, the towel moved. A puppy, blood on its leg, barely conscious. "I found her near the ditch out by the river," the boy stammered. I didn't know where else to go. People talk about you and the dogs and how you help them. Can you help her too?" Thomas didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, took the bundle in his arms, and called out for Luna. She appeared at the door, ears perked. She sniffed the puppy once, then looked at Thomas with urgency. "I need to get her inside," Thomas said. "You in too? What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy whispered. "All right, Ethan, you just did something brave." They moved fast. Towels, warm water, gauze. Thomas' hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this before. The vet was called. The bleeding slowed. And for the second time in less than a month, Thomas found himself hovering over a life too fragile to fight alone. Ethan sat in the corner watching everything unfold, his face pale and his hands shaking. "She was just lying there," he said, barely above a whisper. "Everyone else just kept driving. I didn't think she'd make it." Thomas looked up, meeting the boy's eyes. Sometimes the ones nobody notices end up being the ones who save us. That night, the new puppy lay between Milo and Chip, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan helped Thomas clean the bowls, fold the towels, and carry blankets. And when he left, just before midnight, he paused at the door. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked. Thomas smiled genuinely, for the first time in a long time. "I'd like that." After the door closed and the house grew quiet, Thomas sat back in his rocker. Luna curled at his side. The nursery door remained open, not as a wound, now but as an invitation. The house was no longer a place frozen in grief. It was something else entirely. A shelter, a sanctuary, a beginning wrapped in fur, tears, and second chances. Autumn had returned to Kansas. The wind moved through the fields, like a memory that refused to settle, brushing golden leaves from the trees and scattering them across the yard of Thomas's farmhouse. But this year, the wind didn't carry only silence. It carried life, barks, laughter, voices, and the soft scuffling of paws across wooden floorboards. Inside that once quiet house, the walls now echoed with warmth. The new puppy, who Ethan had named Willow, had made a miraculous recovery. Her leg healed, her spirit returned, and she quickly became the boldest among the trio. Chip remained gentle and cautious, always the first to observe before engaging. Milo, ever playful, had become her shadow, and Luna, the mother who had once appeared on Thomas's porch as a stranger, now rested each night beside his recliner, her eyes always halfway open, as if guarding not just the pups but Thomas himself. Ethan had become a regular part of their world. The shy teenager who once stood trembling with a wounded dog in his arms now came by every afternoon after school, helping feed the dogs, walk them through the fields, and repair the old fence out back. He never said much about his own home life, but the way he lingered near the fire, how he stayed late on weekends and always asked if Luna needed anything, it said enough. Thomas never pried. He simply made sure the boy always had a chair at the table and a place to feel useful. But the real transformation wasn't just in the pups, or even in Ethan. It was in Thomas. He had started cleaning out the nursery, not to forget, but to repurpose. The crib was donated to a shelter downtown. The books and clothes were carefully packed into boxes and given to a local church. He kept only a few items: a tiny pair of socks, a hand-stitched baby blanket, and a music box that still played the tune his daughter used to hum. The room now had 2 beds, small ones for Chip and Milo, with shelves for toys and a sunny spot Luna had claimed as her afternoon nap space. One evening, as the sun dipped low and spilled gold across the fields, Thomas stood in the yard, looking out over the grass as Luna trotted toward him. She had something in her mouth, an old piece of cloth, stiff with dirt. She dropped it at his feet and stepped back, sitting calmly as if presenting something sacred. Thomas bent to pick it up. It took him a moment, but when he turned it over, his breath caught. It was a baby's shirt, one he hadn't seen in years. Faded, pale yellow with tiny embroidered stars. It must have been buried somewhere behind the shed, carried there by wind or time. But Luna had found it and returned it. His knees buckled slightly as he sat down in the grass. Luna stepped beside him, pressing her head into his shoulder. He didn't cry this time. He just sat there, holding the shirt, and let the memories come. But they didn't ache like they used to. They didn't cut. They flowed softly, like a stream washing over stones that had finally worn smooth. "You never stopped showing me how to heal, did you?" he whispered, his voice low. Even now, in the weeks that followed, a new idea began to take root in his mind, one that scared him, but also stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He contacted a local animal welfare organization, spoke to the town council, and started clearing out the old barn behind the house. Ethan helped every step of the way. They installed kennels, brought in blankets, beds, heating lamps. Volunteers came from nearby towns, people who had heard about the man who once refused company, now building something for the abandoned. 6 months later, Luna's porch opened an animal rehabilitation and foster center focused on abandoned mothers and injured litters. No cages, no cold cement floors, just warmth, safety, and quiet humans who listened more than they spoke. The first dog to arrive was a limping mutt found under a collapsed shed during a storm. The second, a nervous Labrador mix left tied to a pole. Within days, they were playing in the yard with Milo and Willow while Chip watched from the porch, tail wagging slowly. The shelter didn't fix everything, but it did something far greater. It gave people like Thomas and kids like Ethan a reason to stay soft. One evening, after a long day of work and noise and laughter, Thomas stood outside the barn watching the sun dip behind the hills. Ethan joined him, brushing sawdust off his jacket. "You ever think she knew all this would happen?" Ethan asked, nodding toward Luna, who was asleep with her pups under the tamarind tree. Thomas smiled. "No," he said. "I think she just saw what was broken and offered the only thing she had to fix it." Ethan looked at him, puzzled. "A puppy?" Thomas shook his head gently. "No trust. And that, more than anything else, was the miracle. Not the healing, not the shelter, not even the survival, but the silent, sacred act of a dog placing her baby into the hands of a grieving man because she saw something left inside him that he couldn't see himself. In that trust, something beautiful had grown. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was real, and in the end, that's how healing begins. Not all at once, not through perfect moments or heroic acts, but through small offerings: a whimper, a paw, a puppy placed on a porch, and the quiet, stubborn decision to open your heart just enough to let life back in.